Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Learn to Love podcast, your guide to everything love, sex, intimacy, and relationships. Each week, your host, Zach Beach, interviews new experts on love, including couples therapists, relationship coaches, sex educators, and best-selling authors. Learn the best tips and cutting-edge wisdom to better love yourself, others, and the world. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, beautiful souls. I'm so positively delighted that you could join us on the Learn to Love podcast. I am your host, Zach Beach, and I'm excited to introduce our guest for today's episode, Thais Gibson. Thais Gibson is an author, speaker, and the co-creator of the Personal Development School, where she teaches Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory, an innovative framework uniting traditional attachment theory, developmental psychology insights, and potent subconscious reprogramming techniques. Thais Gibson has a Ph.D. and over 13 certifications in modalities such as CBT, NLP, somatic experiencing, internal family systems, and shadow work. She really knows her stuff and was previously on the podcast on episode 37, where we talked all about codependency and enmeshment. And she came back onto the show to talk about Limerence, as well as her new book, Learning Love. So without further ado, let's begin. Hello, Thais. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming back on. It's been a few years. How are you today?
I'm doing great. How are you doing?
I'm so happy that you're back. And our last episode was on codependency and enmeshment. And I just thought I'd check in to see if you had anything to add or any latest insights on these two things.
Yeah, I would say some really interesting dynamics that have sort of come up more recently in regards to codependency and enmeshment is that a lot of people who are codependent end up actually having a really difficult time receiving co-regulation. So if we look at root cause, there's this concept or idea called co-regulation where essentially we will attune to another person. Our nervous systems will attune to the nervous system and micro expressions and body language of another person. And then when we see somebody in distress, we will shift ever so slightly or adapt our behaviors to help soothe the other person. And it's part of being in an interdependent relationship. We can self-regulate and we can co-regulate in an interdependent relationship. In a counter-dependent relationship, being the opposite of codependency, what you'll see is that somebody in a counter-dependent space, they will completely reject any sort of regulation from somebody else. They don't want somebody to regulate themselves through them. In a codependent relationship, what's so interesting is that people will often consistently change their behaviors to try to regulate the other person, but they're actually really struggling to receive regulation from someone else. So they will often think that it's their job to help that person regulate and really show up for that person. But at a deeper level, they're usually not being vulnerable enough and expressing their own needs enough to receive proper co-regulation from others, which is part of what caused them to always be running on empty. They struggle to self-regulate, but they're not really being open and vulnerable enough to receive proper regulation through what they would actually need from somebody else. So a really obvious example of this would be maybe an anxious, preoccupied person not feeling safe, being vulnerable enough to say, hey, I need reassurance. So instead, they just try to spend all this time with this person, getting the reassurance in indirect ways, but they're actually blocking themselves from co-regulating because they're not being vulnerable enough to share, hey, this is what I'm looking for. So it's just an interesting finding that's come up more recently in regards to one of the root causes that can create codependency issues.
I think it's so important that love soothes us. Love calms our nervous system, and being in a loving relationships allow two people to help each other de-stress, regulate. And what I'm hearing from you is that actually a phenomenon that sometimes occurs is people reject essentially the other person's efforts and attempts to soothe them.
Yeah, so it's not just that. So that can be one form of it for sure, that somebody actually rejects soothing. And that can be more like counter-dependent, more avoidant attachment style. The interesting, really hidden ingredient in somebody who's codependent, so who's essentially trying really hard to get soothed through other people, is that often because they're not in relationship to self enough to understand what it is that they actually need, they often go about blocking incidentally that soothing from somebody else because they're just trying to spend time around somebody or connect to them or maintain proximity, but they're not able to put their own vulnerable needs into words so that they can actually regulate with somebody else.
So counterdependence is when you reject it. But in this case, the kind of codependence is when you're not fully able to ask for what you're needing in that situation.
Exactly. Leaving you to feel like you're running on empty and then you need to keep maintaining proximity. It's almost like you're getting your needs met so indirectly because you're not able to properly articulate. And thus, if I can't really tell somebody what I'm needing, how am I really getting my needs met?
So I feel like this is a perfect segue to my next question, because first of all, this is the Learn to Love podcast. And second of all, you even have a new book that came out last December, literally called Learning Love. So I have to ask, what is learning love to you all about? What does it mean to learn love?
Yeah. So the context of the book is it's all about attachment styles and something that we created and trademarked called integrated attachment theory. It's actually called Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory. And basically the idea is that what we do is we go through and we've done a tremendous amount of case studies through over 18,000 client sessions and then through tens of thousands of students coming through our programs at the personal development school. And what we found is we can get most people, majority securely attached within a 90-day cycle by focusing on really crucial areas of what causes us to be insecurely attached and how we can move the needle on those things. So that includes reprogramming core wounds through leveraging principles of neuroplasticity and subconscious reprogramming. I have a background in hypnotherapy, so that was where a lot of that information comes from. And so we'll be able to shed these painful concepts or ideas that we're carrying around that we're not born with, that get conditioned into us through repetition and emotion over time. Things like, I will always be abandoned, or I will always be betrayed, or I will be trapped, or helpless, or powerless. These core wounds that we're carrying around and projecting back out onto our relationships. And our core wounds are essentially our baggage, right? For a very simplistic term, if somebody felt abandoned in their childhood, that's not their fault, but it is still their responsibility to work through, right? If we want to shut it once and for all. And so a lot of what happens is if we got abandoned once upon a time, we constantly fear abandonment in the future. Or if we had a lot of betrayal trauma in childhood, we will constantly assume people will betray us as adults. And so it's us being able to actually recondition those concepts or ideas that we're storing subconsciously and bringing into relationship after relationship. So that's sort of pillar number one. Pillar number two is we need to learn to understand our own needs. Going back to sort of that topic of co-regulation, if I don't actually know my needs, how can I possibly convey them to somebody in a way that's likely to truly get them met? So we have to build the relationship to self through understanding our own needs and first learning to meet them in relationship to self. And that's part of what self-soothing is really all about. And once we've done those two pieces of work on our core wounds and needs, then we can bring those needs out into relationships and we can communicate effectively to others. So we cover different pillars of how to effectively communicate so you can actually get heard. One obvious example of this is there is a big difference in a relationship between trying to say something like, hey, you never spend enough time with me, you don't care about me, versus saying something like, hey, I feel a little disconnected this week. I'd love to spend some more time together this weekend. Why don't we plan something fun to do? One way it's called positive framing, and we're actually going to get our needs met and heard more often. The other way, somebody's just going to usually hear as criticism. So we've got core wound reprogramming, self-regulate through meeting your own needs, learn to communicate your needs, learn to regulate your nervous system through things like meditation, breath work, things that are going to keep us out of constantly being in fight or flight, also known as sympathetic nervous system, and move into parasympathetic nervous system. And then the last major pillar is learning healthy boundaries. And so what we found through all of our work and research is that if you're able to really hone in on those 5 major areas through different tools that we provide in our programs or a lot in the book, you can actually become securely attached within a 90-day period of time by focusing on those particular specifics.
Wow, beautiful. Love your presentation. It's such a nice, straightforward, systematic approach to working with our attachment style. We reprogram our core wounds, identify needs, learn to communicate those needs, learn to regulate the nervous system, and set healthy boundaries. And those work together, I assume. It's not like sequential.
Well, in a sense, they tend to be sequential. We teach them sequentially because the main reason, it's a great question, is that a lot of times you'll see that, like, if I don't, for example, reprogram my core wounds, sometimes when I'm in a triggered space, so let's pretend that, I had a huge wound for a long time that I did a lot of work on called the I am trapped core wound. And so as a fearful avoidant, I was afraid of getting trapped. I also had the abandonment side and that anxious side to me. But So let's say I have that wound. When somebody is conveying something to me, I may misinterpret or assume that they're trying to control me or trap me if I'm seeing things through the lens of that pre-existing core wound, which is how triggering works, right? We tend to project our old stuff onto the present moment, and we're sort of seeing through the lens of the past, right? And so when we get into a position where we can realize this is a core wound and we can reprogram it first, usually when you're trying to figure out what your needs are when you're triggered, you're like, my need is to yell at somebody. My need is to,
Needs
it's
you to.
you. Yeah, exactly. So sometimes we think we need something, but it's not really what we need. It's like what we're needing in a self-protective phase when we're trying to just, survive through old trauma again that's being catalyzed into the present moment. So, we try to work through as many core wounds as we can first because it helps us get a clear picture of a need. Like, oh, my need is to communicate to this person that I don't like the way that makes me feel, and we can get clearer. So we tend to try to do core wound work first because it helps us get clearer on our needs. Then we try to meet our own needs first, because when we really understand what meets our needs the best, and when we really understand what those needs are for ourselves, we can more effectively communicate them and convey them to somebody else. And so if we don't get that first part right, we may think we need something, but sometimes we miss the mark a little bit. We think we need like constant, being prioritized as number one in the relationship. But maybe underneath that, we actually just need certainty. And we haven't really learned that about ourselves yet. So, there's that sort of space to be doing that from. And once we get good at communicating, it then helps us with boundaries. So we do teach them mostly sequentially that way. The only exception is the part about emotional regulation, the nervous system work, because you can really start that right from the beginning. And it tends to be a very simple habit you can do, like a 20-minute meditation twice a day, or breath work, or things like that you can generally start when you're doing the core wound work. And it will actually help ease your relationship to your core wounds as you're working through them.
I love it. So I'd love to talk more about this idea of core wounds and how it might tap into core beliefs. I love how you very succinctly define triggering when we project our old stuff onto our current moment. And in your book, you have this diagram on how childhood experiences create a subconscious reality lens of core beliefs, which then color our current perceptions. So what are some examples of like a core belief, and how do they shape our reality?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are about 18 to 20 major core beliefs. And the way you can think of core beliefs is they come from cognitive behavioral therapy. And generally, they're these core ideas that when you poke at them, we're not really going to get further than that bottom rung of the ladder. So an example would be somebody may be telling a story saying, nobody wants to stay with me. I'm not going to find the right person. People always, pull away from me. But underneath that, when you poke at it, well, what are you really making the situation mean when somebody pulls away from you? We're going to hit that bottom rung of the ladder. I am abandoned, right? So the core beliefs are like these big ideas that we've attached to that have a lot of painful meaning. So as you mentioned from the book, we see through the lens of those past experiences. It's almost like you put your core belief glasses on, and we constantly see and do relationships through that lens. And so there are different major core beliefs, and they actually can be really nicely segmented out by attachment style. So the anxious attachment style, their main core beliefs are: I will be abandoned, I will be alone, I will be rejected, I will be disliked, I will be unsafe if people pull away from me, I will be excluded is a really painful one for anxious preoccupieds. And there are some other honorable mentions in there, things like unseen, I'm unimportant, I'm unheard. But those first six are the really big major ones for anxiously attached individuals to work on. On the opposite end of that spectrum, the more avoidant individuals, dismissive avoidance, will tend to have core wounds around: I will be seen as defective or shameful. Childhood emotional neglect often creates these big internalized shame wounds. I will be unsafe. You'll see this, that they actually share in this with all the other insecure attachment styles. They all have unsafe, but different things will make them feel unsafe. So usually conflict will make them feel unsafe, whereas for an anxious preoccupied, somebody pulling away will make them feel unsafe. I will be trapped, helpless, powerless. I don't belong. And you can see a lot of these things, right? And I am weak if I am vulnerable. And so you'll see a lot of those big core wounds show up in the way that dismissive avoidance exemplify their behaviors. And then last but not least, fearful avoidance tend to actually share in both sides of that, where they'll have the core wounds of both sides of the attachment continuum because they have both an anxious and avoidance side. But their two biggest core wounds are: I will be betrayed, and I am unsafe. And so again, they share in that with the other two attachment styles that are insecurely attached. But I am unsafe, I will be betrayed. Most fearful avoidants are like, I don't feel unsafe, but it's emotional unsafety that they're really struggling with. And then underneath that, they share in those other sides.
Well, first of all, I want to say, you know your stuff. For our listeners, Thais isn't reading from her book right now. She's just rattling off all of these things, and it's super impressive. And I do want to say it's been wonderful being connected to you throughout the years, because I see your name pop up in totally unrelated places. Like I'll be in some attachment forum and somebody would be like, "Who do you recommend?" People say, Thais Gibson. If you want to
Oh,
learn about attachment, personal development school, Thais Gibson is the place to go.
that's so sweet.
Um,
Thank you.
so, yeah, I just really love everything that you're saying. And when I look at these major core beliefs, I'm thinking about the opposite, or basically more positive core beliefs, because we have like abandoned, alone, rejected, defective, shameful, unsafe too, right? And I'm thinking, okay, what I'm hearing is that love involves safety, acceptance, security. What would you say is like the opposite of these sort of negative core beliefs that we might want to replace them with?
Amazing question. So, this is exactly what we end up doing. So, this is a part of what subconscious reprogramming is, right? We're not born with these ideas. We've attached to a one sided concept because of painful past experiences. So, how the subconscious gets programmed is through repetition and emotion, because repetition and emotion fires and wires neural pathways, which over time build neural networks. So, what essentially takes place is that we have to fire and wire new ideas to counterbalance this old concept. So, what we're really looking for is the opposite. So, if you look at I am alone, I am worthy of connection, right? Or I'll be abandoned. People will stick around. I can have lasting relationships or love. I will be betrayed. I can trust, or I can have loyalty. I will be excluded. I will be included. I'm not good enough. I'm good enough. So you have these opposing ideas. And there's a really powerful tool that for anybody listening, you can actually start to reprogram these painful old pieces of relationship baggage with. And it's called autosuggestion. It actually comes or has roots. I've sort of overlapped two modalities to build this tool. One is the principles of hypnotherapy and doing a big long form certification in that for a year. And then combine that with cognitive behavioral therapy tools, which is you're taking CBT basically and making it subconscious. So what we do is we take the core belief, let's just use for simplicity's sake, I am not good enough. And we oppose it with I am good enough. And then what we're doing here when we want to recondition this idea is we need repetition, emotion, and imagery. Okay. So I'll go through the whole tool in just a moment, but I just need to give a little bit of a backstory. So your conscious mind speaks language. Okay. So your conscious mind hears like do not, or hey, we should do this. It actually speaks like language. Your subconscious mind doesn't really speak language. It speaks through emotion and imagery. So if I say to you, hey, Zach, whatever you do, do not think of the chocolate chip cookie. Like you probably think of a chocolate chip cookie. You can't help it. So your subconscious will often flash like an emotion or an image. And even though your conscious mind said do not, right? So when we're reprogramming, we need to speak to our subconscious mind, because nobody is waking up and saying, today, I'm going to consciously decide to tell myself 100 times that I'm not good enough, right? These are not conscious decisions or subconscious issues that we're facing. So we need to speak to the subconscious mind because that's where the problem exists. So what we would do here is we would say, okay, I'm not good enough. What's the opposite? I am good enough, to your point, right? And then we need repetition, emotion, and imagery, because we're repeatedly firing and wiring the language of the subconscious mind, emotion, and imagery. So what we're doing is autosuggestion works by finding your core belief that you want to work through, finding its opposite is step one. Step two, we need 10 memories of how we felt good enough. Why memory? Because if I were to say to you, okay, Zach, tell me your favorite childhood memory, you would talk about your favorite childhood memory. Let's say you're playing on the playground. And what would happen is you would actually see the images of the slides and the playground and the memory and the emotions. You would start smiling as you're telling the story, because memories are containers for emotion and imagery. So basically what we do is we take this old core belief, I'm not good enough. Okay, I'm good enough. 10 memories of times where I did feel good enough. That gives us repetition, emotion, and imagery. And we do this for 21 days. And if we do this for 21 days, research shows that's how long it takes to build initial strong neural networks that can help us have new ideas and new concepts about ourselves as we shed these old ones and leave them in the past where they belong.
Well, I love your neuroscience perspective on it, because it is true. Our mind is malleable. And I think a lot of people do think memories are fixed. But every time we open that file cabinet and pull out the memory, it changes a little bit. And we can integrate those memories for a more secure attachment.
Yeah, exactly.
So amazing. And we do have to shift to our topic for today, which I'm sure relates, and we can probably relate it to attachment theory in a lot of different ways. But we're going to talk about limerence. And this is a psychological term, I would say. And I think everyone kind of has an idea what it is. But what is limerence to you?
So limerence originally was actually coined by a psychologist named Dr. Dorothy Tennov. I'm not sure if she was a doctor, but Dorothy Tennov. And she talked about how limerence is basically this state of mind where somebody is obsessively infatuated with another person and constantly thinks about them, basically to the point where it affects their daily life in a negative way. And so there's major factors that differentiate between infatuation, okay, like just a normal crush or interest in somebody, versus limerence. Okay. So we'll have the frequency of the obsession. Okay. So let's say we often refer to the person who is experiencing limerence. They usually have an object of limerence. Okay. So like the person that they have limerence for. So the object of limerence, usually there's this intense frequency of obsession. So the person will think about this person all throughout the day, constantly thinking about them nonstop. The second is the intensity of the obsession. So, they may even resist doing other normal daily things like spending time out with friends and family because maybe they're spending time clicking consistently through that person's social media at home, or they spend time in the fantasy realm with that person and avoid other social activities or working on themselves, growing in different ways in their career or mentally, emotionally, because there's just this obsessive infatuation. Then there's this degree of self-abandonment that takes place with limerence. So often somebody in limerence, when they're so externally focused on somebody else, they are essentially abandoning their own lives to various degrees, right? They're not present in their own body and their own reality doing things. And then we'll see as a general set of rules that there's this impact on their daily life as a result, an impact on their emotional state. It kind of becomes a roller coaster because they'll have these highs when they're experiencing the emotionality of infatuation, followed by these lows when they're not necessarily having this two-way connection. And that brings us to the last sort of feature of limerence is reciprocity. A lot of times somebody can be in a really intense state of limerence, but that there isn't even necessarily reciprocity there. It can be this like one-sided fantasy world infatuation or obsession with somebody. Now, I wrote a course on limerence, and as I was researching a lot of this stuff, something was so interesting. And I actually saw this a ton back when I ran my client practice. But when people are in a state of limerence, what's happening is your mind is a needs meeting machine. It's designed to get your needs met. When you can't get your needs met in the present moment, then what we do is we either break into fantasies of the future, because when we think and feel about fantasies of the future, it simulates our needs being met. The subconscious mind has a difficult time differentiating between what's real and imagined. So fantasies of the future often get us in some form our needs being met, or at least feeling like our needs are met. Or we break into memories of the past. So when we look at limerence, what's so interesting is that limerence is often designed to get our needs met. And we will project our deeply unmet needs, where we feel in a state of learned helplessness, onto another person, whether they'll actually meet them or not. And in that fantasy world, we'll imagine these rich fantasies where somebody's meeting those needs. And oftentimes, it's this subconscious strategy to get closer to those needs through this infatuation and obsession with the person.
So am I hearing from you that infatuation is a maybe more healthy version of like falling in madly in love with someone, and limerence is almost like a pathologized, like it's almost like a mental illness? Like we often describe, addiction becomes a problem when it starts affecting all these other areas of your life. That's when it's like, okay, it's time to get some treatment when you're not fulfilling your obligations of your job or your family or other things.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a beautiful summary. And I'll say as well that I had people that I worked with in my client practice who, and of course, like would never share their names or identities, but just I saw a few times over about the 10-year period or so I was working with people before we started running our programs online. And there can be a diluted aspect to it. There can be a part of this where, I'll give one example. There was this one gentleman I worked with, and he was really in a space where he had such extreme limerence and infatuation for this woman that despite her clear rejections over text message, over email, over phone call, they had been on 2 dates. She decided she wasn't interested in pursuing the relationship, but he kept showing up at her house unannounced, leaving things, dropping letters off, all these different things
Stalking
over and over
almost,
again.
yeah.
And yeah, and so we can actually, you can think of extreme limerence as also just like anything existing along a continuum, but in more extreme places, when we get to these extreme forms of limerence, we can see that there's, this diluted element that can sometimes come into play where somebody's not even able to really see, hear, or receive somebody else's boundaries. And of course, it would be a prerequisite to stalking type of behaviors because we're so attached to the fantasy that it's actually usurping the reality of what's going on in the present moment.
So, what do you think about like people who think this is a normal and good thing to feel? And it's kind of like when you mention fantasy, people are like, I do have that fantasy of falling madly in love with somebody, and we see Juliet ask, where's my Romeo? I can't stop thinking about my Romeo. And I'm sure you could look up the latest, teen rom com and experience all those feelings of like, oh, I can't stop thinking about this person. So what about people who think that this is just a natural experience of falling in love?
So I think to your point, Disney movies and rom-coms maybe do a bit of a disservice because there really is a meaningful difference between love and infatuation. And, we'll go into like the factors that create attraction and sort of loop that back in after. But, when we look at love and we look at the life cycle of a relationship, originally based off of the work of Dr. Susan Johnson, there are 6 stages to relationships. So there is first the dating stage. Okay. It's designed for us to vet somebody, to see if we're a good fit for them, to see if there's chemistry, to try to connect and get to know somebody. If we do take the time to do that effectively, we will move into the honeymoon stage. And of course, there will be elevated neurochemicals like phenylethylamine and oxytocin, the neurochemicals of attraction and bonding, even serotonin and dopamine for well-being and motivation. So we'll have this really nice honeymoon stage. But what we're often seeing in these first 2 stages is that we're still kind of showing ourselves with our mask on, right? We are still on our best behavior largely. And then we get into the power struggle stage. And the power struggle stage of relationships is actually about acceptance and vulnerability. Now, we'll see the dating and honeymoon stage last anywhere from, 0 to 6 months for dating, honeymoon, another year to 2 years afterwards. The power struggle stage is statistically where most relationships end. And also the power struggle stage, people can get locked into for their whole marriage. I mean, people can spend a lifetime in the power struggle stage. And part of the point of the power struggle stage is that we are supposed to take the mask off. We're supposed to let somebody into our inner world, share our insecurities, tell somebody our needs, really learn each other at a deeper level. And so if we are able to do that effectively and show up for each other through that, we move into the stability, commitment, and then bliss stage. And bliss stage is like the honeymoon stage, but you actually know the person. And so I think that when we look at, these rom-coms and things like that, we're kind of given this messaging that there's these grandiose gestures and everything's the honeymoon stage. And then you fight and then you go back into the honeymoon stage. But there's actually really important psychological and relational lessons that exist within the power struggle. And we're supposed to learn to work through conflict with somebody. We're supposed to learn to share our fears and our flaws and our concerns and receive those things from somebody else and learn to work through those things together. And to me, that's really what moves the needle from more conditionally based love, where you're showing yourself with conditions in the early stages, to more unconditionally based love, where you're actually showing yourself more without conditions and thus allowing yourself to be loved more unconditionally. And so, we get this concept or idea a lot of the time where we confuse and intertwine, love and limerence. Oh, because I'm having these extreme feelings, I must be in love, or it must be love at first sight. But a lot of the times, and I saw this a tremendous amount, both in PDS or programs, but also in client practice, is I'll share a story to illustrate this actually. I had this woman, she was engaged. And she came in to work with me. It was like her first or second session. And she was like, Thais, I want to work with you because I'm having like a little bit of, concerns about getting married. I have a few like reservations. And I want to see if this is the right fit for me. So the first session or 2, I was, talking to her and sort of learning about her reservations and what was going on. And 2 things stood out to me about her. Number 1, she felt very unseen her whole childhood. Okay. So she felt like her parents were kind of unavailable. They never really gave her attention. And interestingly enough, her current fiance at the time also was not very available, like wasn't very present, always restless, kind of looking around, looking away, wasn't able to like sit still for long periods of time, didn't really ask deep questions. Anyways, so we're 2 sessions in and she comes back for her third session and she says, I can't get married. And I said, why? What happened? I thought she was here to really do the work around her concerns. And she said, I met somebody in the coffee shop on throughout the week, and I'm sure it's the love of my life. And, it brings up exactly what we're talking about, this idea of, well, is it really the love of your life? Do you really know them? Like, you haven't gone through a power struggle stage with them. You don't know their fears, flaws, insecurities. We know this momentary part of a person. That generally puts it more into the limerence category rather than love. And when we looked at it, the most interesting thing is that what happened, how she met this person is she was in line. She dropped her coffee when she was picking her coffee up from the line, and it spilled everywhere, and she dropped her keys, and this person stopped what they were doing, and he came over and he mopped everything up with her, and he picked up her keys, and he was like, "Are you okay? You seem a little bit stressed," and was just extremely present and available. And so oftentimes, well, I'm not even going to say oftentimes because it's a misrepresentation. All of the times that I ever saw somebody in limerence, this person actually represented two major things. Okay. One, the unmet needs they were starving for since childhood. Okay. And because our subconscious mind's a needs meeting machine, we will see that somebody expresses, this need that we're starving for. And we think we're starving for the person, but often we're just starving for the need. And number two, there's something that drives attraction. So when we look at what drives attraction, it really falls into three categories, but these are two of them: deeply unmet needs. And number two, somebody who expresses your repressed traits. So, for example, there's this thing known as trait variety. And biologically, we're wired to be attracted to that because at one point in our evolution, if we're out in the world trying to just survive and somebody's really smart and they pair up with somebody really strong, together they have a better chance at survival. So we're wired to be attracted to people who express things different than ourselves. And so from this psychological element, when you look at limerence, you'll generally see the things that people fall into limerence for is when somebody's expressing their repressed traits. One example could be somebody's really assertive and you're more shy or timid, or somebody's really outgoing and confident and you're a little more insecure and quiet. So we'll be wired to really attract to that quite quickly. But the biggest thing will literally be somebody meets your needs that you've been starving for a very long time.
You're just a fire hose of knowledge. So let's just, I love it. I love it so much. Again, no notes, just rattling all these things off. So let's review a few things. So first you mentioned the 6 stages of relationship. I have dating, honeymoon stage, power struggle, and then stability, commitment, bliss. That's the next 3?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Amazing. And then the other thing that comes up when I'm hearing you is 2 things. One is what we sometimes hear as love bombing.
Yes.
And I almost feel like that's sort of a predatory behavior for people prone to limerence, or at least trying to get the feelings of limerence out. Like, what can I do to make this person think that, and to fall madly in love with me, I'm going to bomb them with my love. And then they start to have these behaviors that, you see these like documentaries, people give like their life savings to like somebody who love bombed them.
The Tinder swindler.
Yeah, exactly. And then what type or kind of people are sort of prone to experiencing limerence? And I'm also curious if that ties back into certain attachment styles. So just to summarize, that people that do experience limerence tend to have starving needs since childhood that suddenly got met, and they meet somebody who expresses their repressed traits.
Yes.
So yeah, what kind of people might be more prone to experiencing limerence and be also prone to potential love bombing?
Amazing question. So all attachment styles are somewhat prone to limerence because there are usually repressed traits. Okay. So you'll see, for example, that more dismissive avoidant attachment styles often end up being in limerence with fictional characters because they will attach to concepts or ideas, the traits or needs in the character without having to be vulnerable. So they get to get their needs met in the fantasy world without having to confront their core wounds, basically, right? Around fearing being weak if they're vulnerable or shameful if they're vulnerable. So we can see that. But in terms of frequency of limerence, you are going to see fearful avoidance and anxious preoccupieds because they are trying to farm out their needs to other people more, as they both have more of that anxious side, have the most experience with limerence the most frequently, especially anxious preoccupied attachment styles. Now, who's the most prone to love bombing? Well, it's often people who are the least individuated. So what happens is we have this sense of individuation that's supposed to happen in our stages of behavioral development. One of the big facets of this is when we're a teenager. We're supposed to learn who we are, what our needs are, how to self-soothe and self-regulate. And in a securely attached household, we're generally seeing that. But when we instead are already ingrained with people-pleasing patterns and behaviors where we try to derive our sense of self from approval or from acceptance or connection to other people, when we don't learn and take the time to really learn who we are, what we want in the different areas of our lives, what are our dreams in the career area, what is our personal relationship to money in the financial area of life? Do we want to save money or be an investor? Or do we, because when we don't individuate and we don't think of these things, we just end up following culture or status quo, right? We're like, oh, I should spend all my money on fancy things for approval. I should buy a fancy car that I can't afford, or buy brand name clothes all the time that I can't afford either. So, when we don't individuate in the different areas of life, then we're in this space where we're farming out, whether it's in our career or financial area of life or mental, our hobbies, our learnings, our interests, emotional and regulation, our physical health habits, all these different things. If we're not taking the time to figure out who we are, then we are not building a proper relationship to our authentic needs. And thus, because limerence is basically about, somebody who expresses our repressed traits, we haven't taken the time to really come into ourselves trait-wise and express the traits that are authentic to us. But even more so, we haven't figured out how to meet our own needs and what those needs actually are. Then we're very prone to not just limerence, but in particular to love bombing. When we really aren't meeting our needs at all and somebody comes along, and to be perfectly honest, I do believe that the types of people who love bomb in when we're looking at like a more predatory dynamic, antisocial personality disorder, narcissistic personality disorder, people who will extremely love bomb, they're great at figuring out what somebody's needing. They're great at pinpointing the psychology of, oh my gosh, this person's always wanted this thing and I'm going to give that to them. And so what that does is it causes somebody to attach to that person in an addictive way. And then they're willing to do crazy and extreme things to not give up that need being met. But there's a story, and I'll tell you just one brief story. I know I talk a lot, but I'll tell you just quickly.
Keep talking. I love it.
So there's a story in a book. It's one of my favorite books that I've read, definitely in the top 5. And it's a very simple, easy read. It's called The Mastery of Love by Don Miguel Ruiz. Most people know his work, The 4 Agreements. And he has a story, and I don't remember the story exactly because I read this book like 14 years ago or something, but he tells a story, and it's about something he calls the magical kitchen. So he tells the story about how he, imagine that you have a magical kitchen, and somebody comes to your magical kitchen can basically produce any food that you want. You snap your fingers, you want a pizza, the pizza's there. You snap your fingers and you want an ice cream sundae, it's there. But somebody comes to your door one day and they knock on your door and they say, hey, I have a pizza. Do you want my pizza? But in exchange, you have to do all of these things that I'm going to tell you. Well, you're going to say, no way. I have my magical kitchen over here. I can have whatever I want. Why would I take your pizza with all these stipulations? And then the story goes on that at one point, the magical kitchen breaks. And because this person has never had to go out and get their own food, they've always had this magical kitchen. The guy who with the pizza comes a few days later when the person's starving and they haven't eaten. And he says, here's a pizza, but I have all these stipulations. You're going to be like, give me your pizza and your stipulations because you're running on empty. Exactly. And the analogy is used because the Mastery of Love is about self-love in this book. The analogy is used to represent our relationship to self. If we can self-source our needs, if we can be self-loving, self-compassionate, if we can give these things to ourselves, we're not willing to take the BS from people outside of us with all their stipulations if they're not healthy. But if we're running completely on empty, somebody comes, they love bomb us with all of the magical pizzas, but then we see the red flags, we will filter out those red flags if we're starving for love. Right. So that's sort of the dynamic. And I think that that's where the love bombing and limerence kind of overlap is if we don't know how to self-source and we don't know who we are just yet, and we haven't taken time to really figure that out, then we are more prone to staying in relationships that may come with a lot of downsides.
So we should be our own magical kitchen.
Yes.
Basically, make my own little self-compassion pie and a side of non-judgment.
Exactly. And, some people hear that and they think, oh, so just meet my needs myself. Don't meet my needs with others. And I'm not saying that either. A lot of people sort of hear that, but it's both. It's I need to be able to self-source. I want to be a master at being able to know my own needs and meet them and show up lovingly in the relationship to self, and a master at gently communicating and conveying my needs in healthy ways to others and allowing myself to receive from them. And when I have both sides, then I am individuated and I am interdependent. I have the ability to rely on others and to rely on myself.
Individuated and interdependent. And I love what you said earlier, which was, if we are not taking the time to figure out who we are not building a relationship to our authentic needs. Such a lovely insight. So as we're winding down, I need some resolution. So let's say I'm feeling so much limerence. I'm full of limerence right now. And I'm learning, this might not be a good thing after all. What should I do about these feelings? And does that mean I'm not actually in love with this person that I feel so limerent about?
So this is a great question. I will say one caveat to this is most people are like, but I like to feel limerence. Okay. That's one of the biggest objections I'll get when I talk about limerence. So a lot of people will be like, but limerence feels good. But statistically, limerent relationships do not last. Okay. So that's the first thing people should know is that usually when we're in limerence, we are hoping to source our needs from somebody else. And honestly, usually when we're in limerence, we're busy projecting things onto somebody so much that we're not actually seeing that person. And also, the more we put somebody on a pedestal, the more by juxtaposition, we're kind of down here in the pit. And so what ends up happening is we will people please that person. We will self-abandon for that person. We will give up our own opinions and needs and boundaries in front of that person because we're like, oh my gosh, we have them on such a pedestal. We don't act like ourselves around them. We're not authentic around them. And so we're not building a foundation for authentic relating to that person. And lastly, the higher of a pedestal you're on, the further the fall from grace. So often what will happen is somebody's on such a big pedestal, the moment that they make a mistake or they don't show up the way that all of our projections are expecting them to, we get so frustrated and so hurt and so angry. And it usually creates a lot of difficulty in a relationship. So I think the first thing, just to get out of the way there, if somebody's like, but limerence is so great, is limerence has more downsides than upsides. That's the first thing to know. So now that somebody sees the cost of limerence, maybe they'll be willing to do the work on it. So now we look at how we actually work through limerence. Well, limerence is giving you some of the most powerful insights into yourself because it's telling you what needs you're starving for and what traits you are not integrating into the relationship to self. So interestingly enough, we'll start with traits. Interestingly enough, and this happens to people all the time, you know how we talked earlier about the different stages of relationship? We have dating and then honeymoon, and then we go into the power struggle. I can tell you this through working with tens and tens of thousands of people at this point. I have not seen an exception to this yet. Often the things we fall into limerence with in the dating stage, in the power struggle stage, are the very traits we resent the most. I'll give you some examples. Oh my gosh, this person's so assertive. It's so attractive. They're just so good at setting their boundaries so easily. We put this on a pedestal. We're so attracted to this in the dating stage. Power struggle stage, it turns into, they never make compromises with me. They're so good with their boundaries, they forget about me. Other examples. Oh, they're so easygoing. I just love how much they go with the flow. They're so easygoing. They hardly get stressed about anything. Power struggle stage, they never make an effort. They never plan anything. So what you will see time and time again is because limerence is a one-sided perception about somebody at the end of the day. The things that we infatuate with, we will resent later, unless we do trait integration work. So our subconscious mind is trying to attach to somebody for a good reason, when we look at the traits. So usually the people who, when you look at these dynamics that we're so attracted to, we are starving not just for the needs, but for the traits being a part of the relationship to ourselves. So often, for example, if we look at those two things, assertiveness, often people who are really attracted to assertiveness, they actually need to learn their own assertiveness. This was something, although I wouldn't say I was in limerence, this is something I was actually quite attracted to in my husband when I met my husband, is he was so good at just being assertive, like right away off the bat to anybody. Like if he just didn't want to do something, he would just right away, he wouldn't say maybe, or I'll think about it, he'd be like, no, I don't want to do that. Just very easily. And I was like, wow. And as we started going into our power struggle stage, years ago now, I realized I have to learn to actually be more assertive with him, or it's always just going to go the way that he wants. And I'm going to feel resentful and it may not work for me. And so I learned to integrate that trait of becoming more assertive over small things in real time and that was how we really learned to communicate and work through things, as I was better able to show and share myself when we went to the power struggle stage. And that made us stronger, and it helped me appreciate that lesson of becoming more assertive in small forms rather than resent, right? But I was cheating because I already knew that this is how it works, right? I knew what was, I understood about limerence, and I was like, okay, this is stuff that I can hack the process with a little bit. So, but when people don't know these things, they can't get ahead of them, right? So it becomes really, really difficult. Another example would be if we go to the easygoing trait. Let's say somebody's like, oh, somebody's so easygoing. Well, if you're somebody who's kind of a control freak or a little bit uptight, then you're so attracted to this. But unless you learn to also pivot and go with the flow a little bit, then it's going to become problematic. Now, this is reciprocal. This is not one way. The assertive person needs to learn to better make compromises by the other person communicating their needs. That's how we get through that. The easygoing person needs to also learn to take initiative sometimes, right? So we see these different dynamics. And so this is called trait integration work. We look at what we are so attracted to and we put on such a pedestal, and we work to actually practice integrating these traits into our lives a little bit more. How can I be more easygoing or more patient or more open-minded to going with the flow at times? And it doesn't have to be if you're in like a high-powered corporate job and like there's no room for that. It can be when you get home, right? Like there can be these healthy places that we practice this trait. And as we do this, we will take somebody off the pedestal, and we will also be more likely to survive the power struggle stage. Now, limerence isn't always in reciprocal relationships, right? If this is somebody that you're not even dating or in a relationship with, you would still be doing the same work. What are the traits that I'm so attracted to? How can I practice owning these traits more in my own life? Second piece is our needs work. So the needs work becomes us being able to look at what are the big needs that I'm seeing. And the really interesting part of this is you get to look at what you're fantasizing the most about. Your fantasies about another person are never random. You may realize that, oh, you're fantasizing. There's some really common ones I'll see from people. A lot of them will be, I had this discussion with somebody in our personal development school, literally like last week, we did a webinar about limerence. And she said, it was such a good share. She said, I always fantasize about this person seeing me doing things that I'm proud of and thinking I'm special. And
I see some childhood things going on there. Go on.
Yeah. But those are the things that you'd see over and over again, right? And of course, exactly to your point, these are what was her childhood. She felt a void of being seen and feeling significant or special to her family. And other common ones will be people being like, oh, I imagine this person's going to protect me or be, make me feel really important or noticed or make me feel like I matter, and so a lot of what we're doing is we're looking at, well, what are the needs that this person is meeting so much? How can I practice going and meeting these needs in the relationship to myself? And as we learn to meet some of our own needs, like we can see ourselves better by journaling, by meditating, by doing self-work, by trying to introspect about ourselves. We can make ourselves feel important by having healthy boundaries for time to ourselves and by working on growing ourselves in the different areas of life. But exactly what you're trying to source outside of you so badly in the fantasy world just represents what you're starving for in the relationship to self.
I have another example. Sometimes people feel limerence about someone they meet who has such a free spirit. And it's like maybe you feel stuck in your life and in your job, and then you meet some free spirit. And then later on, you're like, you don't want to commit to anything. What do you mean fly to China tomorrow? Like, but also what I'm hearing from you is like, yeah, if you're really attracted to this person, bring that energy into yourself. How can you make your life more free? And how can you make yourself a more free-spirited person?
Exactly. I had this conversation once with this woman, and you remind me of this. She was in a relationship because this happened. Limerence can happen. Limerence is a big root cause of why people cheat too, right? Because they're not getting something met from their partner and from self. And so then somebody comes along, let's say it's somebody they work with, and they're like, oh my gosh, this person represents those needs. And if they're resenting their partner already, they'll often, say to themselves like, oh, well, it doesn't matter that, my partner doesn't care anyways. They're not showing up for my needs. So why wouldn't I do, whatever it is? So this woman in particular, I was working with her. It wasn't about infidelity, but she was in a marriage. She said she was quite happy in her marriage, but she had two young children. They were both under the age of 3, and she was back to work full time in this like extremely intense corporate. It was like a banking job, and it was just very like dog eat dog, serious, intense. So she would like wake up at 5 a.m. She'd like organize everything for the day for her kids, go to work these like 8, 9, 10-hour days, come back, try to make sure she spent time with her kids. Her life was just like back to back to back to back serious. She came into my office one day. We were working on totally different things unrelated to her marriage, but she came into my office one day and she was like, I keep fantasizing about my ex. And I don't know why, because I already know this is not somebody I would want to be with. I'm happy with my husband. I would not even be considering getting a divorce, but I literally can't stop thinking about this person. Like, what is going on? Well, guess what her ex represented? Her ex, their whole relationship was before she was in a serious job. It was from like years and years before. And everything was about fun. It was about taking trips. It was about doing this thing and that thing and, spur of the moment. It was like fun, spontaneity, all these things that she was deeply missing from her life in that chapter or that season. And so what did she do? Well, she made an effort to communicate to her husband that she needed more time to do things that were fun or spontaneous. Even if it was just for once a week, she just had to fill that bucket a little bit. And in doing that, it turned out that she was able to let go of fantasizing about her ex by integrating those needs into her relationship now.
So you kind of answered the next question I wanted to ask, which is, I love this idea of trait integration work. I love this idea of needs work. And I'm wondering about, what if someone who doesn't want to do the work, or is like, work on my patterns and see my fantasies? And what do you say to someone who has some resistance to thinking that, say, being in a loving relationship requires work?
Wow, it's a fantastic question. I would say that the major thing to pay attention to is what the costs are of not doing the work. Okay. And really looking at like how it's affecting your life, your relationships, your capacity to show up in a healthy, functional way, your capacity to actually be in a healthy relationship. Because as we talked about earlier, like statistically, limerence does not work in relationships. It creates this very intense power struggle stage if we even get to that. And so looking at the cost of not doing the work, and then looking at the benefits of actually doing the work, how to improve your love life, your self-esteem, your self-confidence, your ability to relate authentically to somebody else and to be a more whole version of yourself and be in your truth. And what I would say as well is that it's always more work not to do the work.
Oh, I like that little tagline. It's true. You probably would go into relationship after relationship and then, okay, I better learn these lessons. All right. Well, thank you so much, Thais Gibson, for coming on to the show. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with us. I know we went over time, so I really appreciate you sticking around. The founder of Gibson Integrated Attachment Theory and the Personal Development School, author of Learning Love. For our listeners that want to learn more about you and work with you, how can they find you?
So they can go to personaldevelopmentschool.com and they can see all of the different programs we have there. I have a course on limerence. There's actually a 7-day free trial for anybody who wants to go in, check all that stuff out. And they can go to YouTube where I put daily content out called Personal Development School Thais Gibson, THAIS. And our book is also being sold on Amazon.
And I can't forget the question I ask all of my guests, which is, what do you wish everyone knew about love?
I wish that everybody knew that true love starts with the relationship to their self and really being able to know ourselves and understand ourselves, be present with ourselves and really explore what it is that we're looking for in this lifetime. And that will help you be prepared for everything outside of you.
Amazing. You're just an absolute fountain of wisdom, Thais Gibson. And you also present really complex ideas, this great ineffable of love, where you express it so well and eloquently and succinctly. And I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was so fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Wow. What an incredible interview. Thank you, listeners, so much for listening. We hope you remember all of the valuable lessons that Thais Gibson shared with us today, including the 5 steps to learning love. Step 1, reprogram core wounds. Step 2, identify your needs by building your relationship to yourself. Step 3, communicate and bring those needs into the relationship. Step 4, learn how to regulate your own nervous system. And step 5, practice healthy boundaries. Next, understand triggering. which is when we tend to project our old stuff onto the current moment. A lot of those triggers will be those that press on our core wounds. To someone who is anxiously attached, their core wound is the thought that they will be abandoned. For the avoidant, it's I am defective. Limerence is when someone is obsessively infatuated with another person so much that it affects a person's life in a negative way. A person most likely experiences limerence because they have starving needs since childhood that suddenly got met. In this way, limerence can give you powerful information about yourself because it tells you your deepest needs. And finally, don't forget, true love starts with our relationship to ourselves. So remember, you are perfect just the way you are. You are lovable, loving, and loved.
Thanks again for listening to the Learn to Love podcast. To learn more about the show and your host, head over to zachbeach.com or theheartcenter.com. You can also follow Zach on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.